Good evening and welcome to this conference regarding insects on the plate, history of entomophagy in the West.
So if you prefer the English version, please click on the icon below the little planet. Thank you.
On June the 18th, that's last Sunday, the Day of Sustainable Gastronomy was celebrated. This is a date that recognizes gastronomy as a cultural expression of the natural diversity of the world. And within this framework, sustainable gastronomy, sustainable cuisine refers to the use of natural products, local products that reduce the food waste and the footprint, the environmental footprint, and therefore it is environmentally friendly. And we thought it would be a good idea to devote a webinar to sustainable cuisine, but focus on a specific ingredient, i.e. insects, as an alternative source of protein. And we have invited two experts, Marta Ros and Sandra Lozano. Welcome for being here with us today. Sandra is a doctor in archaeology and works at the research department at the Pompeu Fabra University, and she is a professor at different education centers and universities. And she has also managed the publication of a collection on archaeology, and she is going to tell us about the history of entomophagy in the West, because it's important to understand the role of insects in the evolution of the human species. Whereas Marta is a nutritionist and a food technologist, and she did her PhD on insect protein as an alternative protein, and she is a professor of health science, and she is member of the Food Lab Research Group, and she cooperates with the Boyi Foundation. She will tell us about the main research lines that we have today in nutrition and in the environment in association with insects, and that can help increase their acceptance as alternative proteins in cuisine. We are interested in opening up a discussion on entomophagy, i.e. eating insects, and to have this historical and anthropomorphic practice that we see in some areas in Africa, Asia, and South America, although it's less common in our closest environment, and there is a phobia in many cases to insects. So we will be looking at this topic from the perspective of sustainability, because this is very much aligned with our work at Fundasplay, where we try and raise awareness about the main social and environmental challenges in the food industry. And we conduct different educational activities, and we organize conferences and webinars such as this one, and we have organized an exhibition at our headquarters at the Prat de Llobregat And I will now show you a short video of this exhibition before we start with the presentation. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I'd like to say that this webinar is part of a cycle of conferences that we organize within the Eat Live project that is part of the European Union Live project. And it has as a goal to mean the farm to table objectives from the EU, i.e. to reduce the carbon footprint of food production, to ensure access to food, and to guarantee a safer, fairer, and more sustainable food system. I will now give you the floor, Marta and Sandra. I'd just like to tell the audience that if they have any questions, they can write them on the chat, and then we will reply to the questions at the end of the presentation. Sandra, the floor is yours. Hello, it's a pleasure to be here today with you and to be able to talk about this controversial but very interesting topic about the history of insects as food.
Bien, si puedo tener, sí, aquí vemos la presentación.
As Bárbara was saying, I have decided to focus on the West because there are parts of the world where eating insects is very natural and is part of the culture of many peoples in Africa and in Asia and in South America, whereas in the West, we don't have this habit of entomophagy, and I will explain why today entomophagy is not common in the West. First of all, it is necessary to explain that the history of insect consumption is not easy because it's difficult to find evidence, because archaeological sites are now our main source, but insects aren't usually fossilized, and those that are fossilized just belong to the environment, but they don't necessarily form part of the food system of the past. Although we do have some evidence in the analysis of the bones where you can see the main diet of that person whose skeleton is found in an archaeological site. Additionally, in more recent periods, we do have historical texts, and there are authors who do refer to the habit in Europe of eating insects, but there isn't much evidence in any case.
Y por otro lado, también ha
And
despertado un
the
poco el interés de la
scientific
comunidad científica en
community in the
profundizar
past
los usos de
weren't
insectos.
focused on this
Bueno,
topic either. So there
queda
is
mucho por explorar.
room
Lo que
still
sí que
for
puedo
research.
avanzar como
In any
hipótesis central,
case,
como idea
generally
global que me
speaking, I'd
gustaría
like to say
que quedara,
that even if
aunque no
we're
nos lo
not aware
parezca,
of that,
los insectos
insects have
siempre han
always
estado
been
presentes
present
socioeconómicamente
in the
en los
West at
márgenes de
the
la alimentación.
margins
Es
of the
decir,
food
nunca han
supply. They've
constituido
never
una
been at
parte
the
central de nuestra
core of the
dieta,
food
pero
system,
sí
but
han
they have
estado
been
presentes de alguna manera.
present at
Y
some
los contextos donde
point
más
or at some
los
extent. And the
encontramos
context
son en contextos
where
algo
we
especiales. Por
find the
ejemplo, momentos
consumption
de
is
hambruna.
during
Sabemos
famines.
que el consumo de insectos
Insects were
tenía lugar en
consumed in
muchas
the
partes,
West
en
when
muchas
there
partes del
was
siglo XX.
famine. We also
También
know
sabemos que hay
that there
lugares
are
que
places
conservan
that
ciertas
still have a
particularidades
taste
ciertos
for
insectos
insects,
y que se
and
mantienen
this
en el
is
tiempo, como es la
something
cosa muy
very
local, ¿no? Muy
local of
específica
some very
de lugar
special
concreto.
places in Europe.
También
It
es
is
habitual
also
encontrar
usual to
insectos
find
en el mundo
insects
de la
in
medicina
the
y también a
world
veces lo
of
vemos en el
medicine, and
mundo de los
also
rituales, ¿no? De
we
las
see
religiosidades,
that
¿no? Y
insects
como
can
veis,
have a
sí que en
ritual
todas estas
character in religions.
expresiones culturales de la
So
alimentación que no
insects are not
están en
at
el
the
centro
core of the
seguro,
food
como muchas
system,
otras
but at
religiones,
the
sí
margins
que
of
ahí
the
es
food
donde
system.
los
They
insectos
have
no
been
han perdido su
present there
esencia a lo largo del
through
tiempo, aunque
time.
haya sido más o menos testimonial.
Now I like to
Pero vayámonos
focus
al
on
origen de
human
todo, vayámonos a la
evolution,
evolución
and
humana
I
y vamos
like to
a
explain
explicar un par de
the
ideas de
role of
qué papel
insects
cumplieron
in
los
the
insectos
setting
en la
up
configuración de
of
nuestra
our
especie.
species. You
Sabéis que la
know
evolución
that
humana es
human
ese gran
evolution
proceso
took
histórico que
millions
dura
of
varios
years,
millones de años,
and it's
¿vale?
a
Y que
process
consiste en un
through
proceso
which
gracias al cual se van a dar una serie de especies de
we
primates
have
y de homínidos que terminarán dando
species
lugar
of
al
primates
Homo
that
sapiens, que es
ended up
nuestra
in
especie y la que
Homo
ahora
sapiens.
nosotros
That's what
somos
we are
Homo
today, this
sapiens.
human
Esa
evolution.
evolución
When it
humana,
started,
cuando
it
comienza,
didn't
no
appear
aparece
as an
aislada. Nosotros somos el
isolated event.
resultado de
We
una
are the
larga
result
trayectoria de
of a
primates insectívoros.
long
Es decir, nuestro
trajectory
árbol
of
genealógico parte de
primates
una
who
rama
ate
de la de los
insects.
primates
Many
y
of
muchos de estos
those
primates
primates who
incluso
were
fueron
our
autores de sus
ancestors
cielos.
would eat
De hecho,
insects.
hay
And there are
teorías
theories that
que
show
demuestran que
that
probablemente buena parte de
a
nuestra psicomotricidad
large
fina con las manos,
part
¿sabéis?
of
Nuestra
our
capacidad de ser
fine
muy precisos
psychomotor
con los
skills,
movimientos de las manos,
as well
así como
as
la visión
our
estereoscópica que
stereoscopic
tenemos, que es esa
vision.
capacidad de
So
enfocar
both the
con
fine
los dos ojos
psychomotor
en un
skills
punto,
and
¿no?
our
Focalizar objetos que
stereoscopic
están muy
vision
cerca y muy pequeños,
is
probablemente
likely
es
one
una
of
de las
the
consecuencias
consequences
de esta
of this evolution
trayectoria de
from
primates que tendrá
primates
que ver
that
con, ¿no? de
used
estos
to
primates
eat
insectívoros. De hecho, el
insects.
chimpancé
In
que veis aquí
fact,
en la foto, tanto el
bonobos and
chimpancé como el bonobo,
chimpanzees
que son estos primates
that
que aún hoy en
still
día
live
conviven con
today
nosotros
and
y
who
son
are our
nuestros primos más
closest
cercanos,
relatives, they
son
are
un
a
buen recurso
good
para observar
resource to
qué
see
papel tenían los
the
insectos en la
role of
alimentación de estos
insects in
primates del
the
pasado.
food
Y, por ejemplo,
system of
sabemos pues, que
these
los
primates,
chimpancés
and
en la actualidad
chimpanzees
son muy
are
hábiles a la hora de poder alimentarse
very
utilizando herramientas,
skillful
¿no? Una cosa que
using
parece
tools
propia del ser
to
humano, pero
eat
no
some
solo nosotros las usamos. Los
insects.
chimpancés
They use
utilizan
sticks
palos para
and they
meterlos dentro
put them in
agujeros de aire
the
de los nidos de las
termites' nest,
hormigas
and
para que
then
los
the
niños
termites
suelten el
go
palo y
up
los chimpancés son
that
capaces de
stick, and
chuparlas y
then
así
the chimpanzees
alimentarse
suck
de
them
ellas. Pues en
and
la
eat
arqueología
them.
se ha explorado la
And
posibilidad
the
de que los
first
primeros
steps
esclavos de
of
nuestra cadena
our
evolutiva también utilizaran
evolution
estrategias
are made
similares
up
para seguir
of
aprovechando este recurso natural
primates who
de los
used to
insectos.
eat insects. In
De
fact,
hecho, todo
the
apunta a que los
Australopithecus,
australopitecos, que son
that would be
nuestras
the
abuelas
first
evolutivas, la
species
primera especie,
of
¿no? de
our
nuestro árbol, tenía una dieta
genealogical
más
tree, had a
variada y
very
oportunista,
varied and
en el sentido de que
opportunistic
aprovechaban todo
diet.
tipo de recursos que pudieran
And we
aportar
are
los
sure
nutrientes. Y entonces sí
that
que estamos
in the
seguros de que
diet
en la
of
dieta de los
Australopithecus,
australopitecos los
insects
insectos
played
tenían un
a
papel
very
fundamental.
important
Probablemente también lo
role.
tuvo en el
And
primer
we
integrante
also
de
believe
nuestro género biológico,
that
del género
this was
Homo, ¿no?
also
El
the
Homo
case
habilis es el
in
primer
the
representante
Homo
que todavía es un
habilis,
híbrido,
who is a
es un miembro
member
del
of
género
the
Homo muy
Homo
tan avanzado
species,
como
but
los que
not
vendrán
so
después,
advanced, and
y
who
que todavía no ha
hasn't
aprendido a
learned
cazar.
to
De manera que
hunt
aún sigue
it, and
necesitando tener
who is still opportunistic in their diet, eating any resources that are available. Further beyond the Homo habilis, it seems that insect consumption tended to be less and less important, and this is related to many different things. What you can see now on the screen is a part of Africa in Somalia, on the east of Africa. Here we see the development of the Homo erectus and the Homo habilis. And something special happened in this area because there was a rift that separated the east part of Africa from the central part of Africa. And what happened then? The central part of the continent maintained its forest ecosystem, whereas in the east, the weather was much drier without trees. This means that the strategies for these primates that were in this area, they had to find many different strategies, many very different from those primates that stayed at the forest, who could still climb up trees and who continued with the opportunistic diet. However, the primates on the east had to develop a different anatomy. In fact, they started standing on their feet, they lost their hair, and they developed certain characteristics according to the environment. This may be one of the causes why insects stop being part of our diet, because in the savannah, if you think about the savannah, in these large dry prairies with no trees, insects there weren't abundant, unlike in the forest and in the jungle. And we see that our ancestors tried to feed themselves with fish and mammals. All their hunting tools to process food were designed morphologically to be able to cut meat, squash bones. This means that mammal meat became one of the main sources of their diet. Firstly, eating what was left on the carcasses until they learned to hunt. In the Neolithic, this is a stage in human history where we stopped being nomads and we became sedentary. The Neolithic process happened in many places around the world, not simultaneously, but autonomously. And there were several focuses of the Neolithic where there were settlements, stable settlements, and then they started to farm. To become farmers and shepherds and stop being hunters. In every place in the world where the Neolithic was developed, the inhabitants had some specific varieties of animals and plants that they use to feed themselves. In Europe, the Neolithic period comes from the Near East, that's Turkey and Iraq, that's the area of Western Asia, and that's where the Neolithic is seen for the first time, and where the plants and animals were domesticated until reaching today's age. What happened in the Neolithic had a huge impact on the Western diet, and in each area with its own species. Our animal species that were tamed and domesticated were these four: cows, pigs, goats, and sheep. Little by little, as this was a new strategy to obtain food, i.e. farming, and it requested a long-term effort because you cannot reap a harvest overnight. And this changed the use of time. Suddenly, this food system meant a change in culture because hunting didn't disappear and collecting fruits didn't disappear either, but they were negligible compared to farming. And in Europe, insects form part of the core diet because we chose a certain type of diet based on intensive farming, time-consuming, and cooperation-consuming. And it was farming mammals because in other places in the world, such as Latin America, the Neolithic didn't mean domesticating animals, but plants. And that's why in South America, insects and other wild animals continue to be essential for many South American and Mesoamerican peoples, whereas in the West, cows, pigs, goats, and sheep were the key animals. The insects were still there, but what happened to insects? Why didn't we continue to eat insects if they are a readily available resource? Well, firstly, farming is not an activity that gets on well with insects. Insects are not friendly for farming because insects cause pests and diseases, and the relationship of humans with insects wasn't very friendly because they were taking care of their plants and animals, and insects would harm them. And the absence of insects in Europe also has to do with the pre-industrial communities, because before the industrialization, then in the past, communities would base their identity on the common traits of the group. What does it mean to belong to the Ibero group? Well, the Ibero group would have certain traits. They would build houses in a certain way and eat in a certain way. The same happens for Tuaregs. Tuaregs are shepherds, and they dress as all Tuaregs too. So there's this personal identity of the pre-industrial communities that are based on the traits characterizing their group. And when the printing press appears, before that, in fact, when writing appears, then
por lo que comen.
Other communities are considered barbarians because they eat things that the West communities eat. For example, in the West, bread and beer were part of the diet, but not, for example, in Mesopotamia. And whatever is not a habit in your own community is not something you can access freely, unlike the current individualistic society. So, during the Neolithic, we see the plants and animals that will characterize our communities until the industrial era. There is evidence, there is news of insects as food, but it's negligible. Here we have some examples from ancient Greece, because there are some writers who describe the culinary habits of other communities. For example, the Greek historian Herodotus explains in the 4th century before Christ that there are nomadic tribes in Central Asia who eat lice. What else happens in Greece? Well, the Greek and the Roman develop a very elitist type of gastronomy, and exotism was highly valued. This was a characteristic of the elites in the Greco-Roman period. And within this framework, we do find references to insects that the Greco-Roman elites would eat. For instance, Aristotle in the 5th century before Christ tells us that the taste of the grasshopper worm is better in its last stage of development. This means that some Greek men would enjoy eating insects such as grasshopper worms. And the same goes for ancient Rome. And we have, for instance, Plinius the Old, who refers to news from Eastern peoples eating grasshoppers, and he also refers to the larvae of the red longhorn beetle that is considered a delicacy, especially when fried in batter of wine and flour. In any case, this evidence is negligible, and the insects are not part of the traditional recipes of ancient Rome or ancient Greek. The situation continues from the ancient classic period to the Enlightenment. So we just see some new evidence referring to times of famine or need, but we see a change in the concept of insects during the Enlightenment between the 17th and 18th century, where there is a cultural thrive, and we'll see the scientific way of understanding the world imposing them itself. It's the time of Newton and the advances in mathematics and in physics, and the discoveries regarding the void and temperatures. And it is then when once again, as we see in ancient Rome and Greece, there will be scientists and philosophers that will pay attention to communities outside Europe that have as a habit to eat insects. And here we have this book by Ulysses Aldrovandi from 1602, and he writes this book on animals and insects, and there is a chapter on the use of various insects as food in different parts of the world, such as ants in India or bee pupae in China. We should remember that in the 17th and 18th century, Europe started its colonization period, and they came into touch with these other communities, faraway cultures that integrated insects in their diet. Also, during the Enlightenment, something very strange will happen, and it's the following. The intellectual elites will start thinking about food in a scientific way, objectively, and thinking about it as a scientific artifact. Until the Enlightenment, the food and diet wouldn't change within a community, and if any changes took place, they weren't sought. So we have the Enlightenment and this scientific approach, and wherever there is this scientific approach, we see a very strange phenomenon in the 18th century, and that's the introduction of the potato. Antoine Parmentier, I don't know whether you know him, but he was responsible for bringing potato from America that was discovered in the 16th century. At first, potatoes weren't used in Europe because they were considered toxic, but it was Antoine Parmentier, a Frenchman, who thought of a way of solving famine by introducing this food that's not toxic if well cooked, and he started a campaign in France in favor of potatoes, and he invented many different strategies so that the French would start eating potatoes. And it's thanks to him that we eat potatoes, and it's potatoes that saved many populations in Europe from famine. And the exercise that we have today of introducing insects in the diet is not something new, because in the past we have, for example, Antoine Parmentier, who introduced a new food, i.e. the potato. I also have some examples from the 19th century with scientists that continue discussing the diet, and we have Charles Darwin's grandfather, i.e. Erasmus Darwin, who was an expert in botanic, in animals and plants, and he wrote in 1800 the book Phytology, and there he stated that the larvae of Melolontha, that's Coleoptera, could be served as food because they feed on roots and leaves and therefore are not toxic. This idea appeared in the 19th century, and then Vincent Holt was also a naturalist and biologist who wrote a pamphlet called Why Not Eat Insects? And he states many arguments regarding the sustainability of insects for the diet because they are easily reproducible and that it would be beneficial for the European diet. And he proposes French recipes with insects. And to end, today, at present, although insects are present in our diet, it's a very negligible presence. We have some communities that do introduce insects such as queso marzo in Sardinia. It's a cheese made with a larvae that helps with the fermentation of the cheese that is eaten with the larvae alive. But it seems that the EU hasn't approved this, so it shouldn't be part of human consumption, but this cheese has existed in Sardinia for a long time. And in Catalonia, snails are also eaten, although snails are not insects, they are gastropods that are in the European diet due to local habits. And then we have these new food uses of insects motivated by the sustainable arguments that Marta will tell us about now. That's all. Thank you from my side. Wow. Thank you very much, Sandra. It's been very interesting. It's been wonderful to see the history of insect consumption in just 20 minutes and how it is related to the domestication of plants and animals. We've been able to see this whole evolution and how they were considered exotic in ancient Rome and Greece. And there is this history behind insects in the diet that is very interesting. And now we will have Marta offering us this current status of this topic of the introduction of insects as an alternative protein in our diet. Yes, I will. It would be good to follow Parmentier's footsteps. Thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar, to this webinar. And I would like to speak how we can develop dishes based on insects. And I would like to thank Fundesplai for supporting this type of scientific research. I would like to focus on the current situation because the food system is one of the main drivers of climate change, and the idea is to have more sustainable and environmentally friendly food systems because we have an expanding human population, and according to the World Bank, the global population is expected to increase to 9 billion by 2050, which means we need to produce around 50% more food in order to feed an extra 2 billion people. The FAO says that entomophagy could also offer a solution to the food shortage that is expected to occur with the growing population, and insects represent 80% of the animal kingdom. There are millions of species, and many of them are edible, and they offer proteins and fat and micronutrients. And we have, for example, beetles that are farmed, and edible insects and their breeding for human consumption have several environmental benefits because it reduces the greenhouse gases, and the breeding of insects for human consumption has a smaller and more reduced carbon footprint. And in terms of regulations, the EU published their regulation in 2021 about edible species such as the Apis mellifera. But it doesn't include all the insects, and this has created some uncertainty. And it's important to review, therefore, this food safety regulation. Very often we see many cultural barriers for the acceptance of edible insects, and in 2021 the Food Health Agency, European Agency, the EFSA, considered some insects as appropriate insects for human consumption. Here we have the details. And together with the UOC Food Lab, together with Dr. Bagfat and Casas, we've done a systematic review of the environmental impact of edible insect consumption following the PRISMA requirements, with 25 studies in animals, 6 in humans, and 7 on sustainability results. And in this discussion, in this review, we looked at the sustainable development goals according to the 3 dimensions of food sustainability: the health dimension, the social and economic dimension, and the environmental dimension. And we see that if we take into account the globality of edible insects, we do meet these SDGs. In the area of health, we find that edible insects have a specific nutritional value because, for example, they have a high quantity of essential nutrients, and about 80% of insects are edible. For example, grasshoppers that can be more nutritional than some other traditional foods. For example, it's very important to cover and meet the protein needs in diets that are only based on cereal, because they can be poor in some amino acids. And many of these edible insects are rich in proteins, and they have from 7 to 48% of proteins, and their amino acids are also very important. And most edible insects have
A més del seu alt contingut
fatty acids and vitamins and minerals
com per exemple pot ser doncs,
and
el ferro,
group
el zinc,
B
les vitamines
vitamins.
del grup B.
By way of
Com a
conclusion, we can say that edible
poden convertir els substrats orgànics
insects
en productes rics en
have
energia i proteïnes, contenen nivells
fatty
d'àcids
acids
grassos
such
doncs,
as
com abans he dit, més
omega-3
importants,
and
omega-3
unsaturated
i els
fatty
insaturats.
acids.
I després
And
també
today, for
que,
example,
actualment, per
it's very
exemple, és molt
important to
important
look at the
productes
omega-3
grassos,
fatty
omega-3,
acids
perquè
because we are now relying too much on fish fatty acids, and it's important to look at the sustainability, and they also have an insoluble fiber from their exoskeleton and a supplement of 0.5 grams per kilogram of glycosaminoglycans can significantly reduce abdominal and epididymal fat weight, blood glucose, and total cholesterol levels. Here we have the significant levels. These results are included in the literature from the animal studies, and a supplement of 5 milligrams per kilogram of chitin of chitosan reduces body weight and abdominal fat accumulation versus controlled diets, and in other studies in animals, a dose of 7 to 15% of edible insect significantly improves life weight and reduces levels of triglycerides, cholesterol, blood glucose, and increases microbiota diversity versus the control diet. Therefore, we see that doses of up to 7% of edible insect in the diet significantly improves the gut health and reduces systemic inflammation because of their bioactive peptides that are anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, and antioxidative, and it includes a significant increase in blood concentrations of essential and branched-chain amino acids and slowing of digestion versus the whey treatment. Now we're going to look at the environmental dimension and their relevant KPIs, such as the greenhouse gases, where we see a reduction versus the traditional farming. So we have a better sustainable performance in insects that are fed with organic co-products. And different types of insects for food consumption were analyzed, and the farms with a mixed diet with wheat and carrots, for example, would double the values of greenhouse gases. And the waste of the insect farms is negligible versus the traditional animal farms, and the environmental benefits of insects are much higher than those of traditional farming in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and reducing the use of land, and also in terms of energy. So by way of conclusion, we can say that insect farms offer a better conversion of food, a more efficient conversion of food. Often, when referring to insect farms, when we talk about feed, it's for animals and food is for humans, and edible insects can use food waste, and in that way, this is economically more feasible, and there is a study about the use of energy in farms and efficient use of energies in farms, and renewable energies have an important role to play. So there is a replacement, for example, of fish meal and fish oil for feeding this type of animal and using these insects as part of the diet. And edible insects promote the growth of inclusive economy. It's an accessible and affordable protein. It promotes circular economy. It also gives value to products that have no value today, that were considered waste. They're very versatile in the market, and it shows new applications in the food technology with new margarines and butters, hamburgers. And we have to work on the acceptability, creating positive experiences. This is the key for the future of edible insects. Here you can see some products that are available on the market based on edible insects, and there are many brands that are creating new products. For example, we see here some processed foods. This would be category 2 because we have insect meal as a processed food, and we have to see how we can introduce these products in our culture through products such as flour or pizzas or bread, and not using the full insect as an ingredient. Here we see many brands and startups and businesses that work in this area and that are expanding, because this is a new food for the future. This is one of the papers that were published recently that refers to consumers' acceptability and perception of edible insects as an emerging protein source, because in recent years in Western Europe, studies on entomophagy have drawn the attention of many researchers interested in identifying parameters that could improve the acceptability of insect consumption in order to introduce insects as a sustainable source of protein into the future diet. Analyzing the factors involved in consumer acceptability in the Mediterranean area could help to improve their future acceptance. This is a cross-sectional study, and it was conducted using an ad hoc questionnaire which 1,034 consumers participated, and only 15% of participants had tried insects, and discussed lack of customer and food safety were the main reasons for avoiding insect consumption. Consequently, it's important to offer preparations with an appetizing appearance, with flowers being the most accepted format, and the 40 to 59-year-old age group was the one most willing to consume them to introduce edible insects as food in the future. It is important to inform people about their health, environmental and economic benefits, because that could increase their willingness to include them in their diet. As for the distribution of food, interaction, context, and level of reception by population group, here we see at the top the circumstances of introduction of new foods into the diet, whereas at the bottom chart we see the population group and willingness to welcome insect consumption. We see, for example, that during the holiday period, this is when these products are introduced there is this perception that the younger audience would accept edible insects more. However, there is an older group that is also very open to their consumption. So what are the key ideas? Firstly, we need unique use in Western culture as flour. We have to create positive experiences, and it's important to create new cuisine experiences, and it's important as well to inform about the sustainability and health benefits of edible insects, and also d'aquest producte amb similars
establish
the percentage of inclusion of these ingredients in different products, because it's important for this protein to become a sustainable protein. This means that we don't want this ingredient just to be an exotic ingredient. We want it to become the protein of the future. And this paper had a huge impact with over 60 interviews in the media, and I think it's a way of showing all the research done until now. And I'd like to explain a new activity. This is a tasting, and we'll be analyzing the nutritional quality, the sensory characteristics, and acceptability of 3 products based on edible insects. And we want their percentage to be the same as that of a traditional supplement. The idea is for these products to be well accepted, and we're lucky because we have insect label and the Pascual group that have sponsored us with their products, and they have helped us with this research process. Here you can see how we have extracted this insect meal, and we also see the formulation of the food product, and one of its main benefits is the emulsification capacity. This is a key benefit. We also have here the methodology of our research, starting with a question regarding phobia to insects, and if the score was higher than 4, because we have 10 questions, and it's important to see how interested a person is in new food, whether they are anxious about trying new products. So what we do is evaluate the neophobia, and when the score is lower than 4, and this is supported by scientific studies, and then they would be included in these studies, because we want to reject those who have neophobia, who don't want to try new foods. Here we have, for example, the sensory tasting sheet that will be used next week, and we hope that at least we can raise awareness, and we can establish which are the trends in terms of taste, so that in the future we can conduct a clinical trial, which is planned for September, and we can start with a product that may work for our target group. And this is our idea. And I'd just like to end with a quote by Joshua Evans of Nordic Food Labs. And he says that entomophagy is about more than merely getting a precise amount of protein on a plate. It's about making sure everyone on the planet has access to food that is affordable. And that is our vision. We don't want to just replace traditional protein. We want to show that mindset shift is necessary, because we do have a problem of access to food, and edible insects may be one of the solutions. There are many other solutions, and we as humans need to change, as I say, our mindset. That's all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marta. It's very important to conduct this type of studies to have a more precise diagnosis for the implementation of new proposals. Without research, we don't know the population's reaction will be. So I wish you the best of luck for your event on Tuesday. I'm afraid that we've reached the end of our webinar, and I'm just going to ask you one question, and it's a question about risk. In fact, one of the participants has asked us about the risk, about nutritional risk, allergies, whether the allergies are similar to that of shellfish, because there may be microorganisms living with insects that could be detrimental for human health. If you could just answer this question briefly. In fact, we are working with the insects, edible insects authorized by the EFSA, because they pose no risk for humans. And we are using these for our research because there is a literature on these species. And one of the criteria that we had to submit to the ethics committee, because the tasting that will take place next Tuesday will be with humans, and this referred to the microbiological content of each batch of flour, and we have to meet the same requirements as any other food stuff. In this case, we have seen that the values were even lower than those of a lettuce, of a common lettuce. Of course, we need to pass all these food safety requirements, and we have to do the relevant risk tests, but we are following a very safe path. Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you very much, Sandra. I don't know whether you have any episodes of your podcast devoted to this topic, because this historical approach is highly interesting. I don't know whether you've ever done that and whether it will available on Spotify. Yes, yes. I have this podcast called Gastromovidas, and in the second season, we will have a chapter on an episode on insects, a very interesting topic and a crucial topic for our future, because it's true that
que se esté pensando en los
people
insectos por el
think
aspecto de la
about
sostenibilidad,
edible
pero me hace
insects
sentido que,
just in
el tema de la
terms of
salud, de que es un
sustainability,
alimento
but we should
muy
also think of
saludable,
insects in
efectivamente saludable.
terms of health.
Y
All right, so we'll look forward to that. Thank you very
Muchas gracias
much to our speakers and to our audience. See you soon. Thank you.
gracias.
Gràcies, adéu.